Today we're diving into a topic that's been a hot button issue for quite some time, tipping culture in America. You know that customary practice where customers are expected to add a little more to their bill as a token of appreciation for service? But before we delve into the complexities of tipping, let's first understand how this practice came to be. According to Saru Jayaraman, the co-founder and co-director of Restaurant Opportunity Centers United and director of the Food Labor Research Center at UC Berkeley, said tipping actually originated in Europe as a vestige of the feudal system. It was a superior giving money to an inferior. Fast forward to the United States, and tipping became prevalent after the Civil War when employers sought to avoid paying recently freed slaves by passing the burden of wages onto customers. So after the Civil War, there was a significant shift in the labor landscape, particularly in the southern United States where slavery had been abolished. With the emancipation of slaves, many former slave owners were faced with the prospect of having to pay their labor force for the first time. However, rather than absorbing these costs themselves, some employers sought ways to offset the expenses of paying their workers. One strategy that emerged was to shift the burden of wages onto customers through the practice of tipping. And by introducing tipping, employers could pay their workers a lower base wage, often well below what would be considered a livable income, with the expectation that tips from customers would make up the difference. This effectively transferred the responsibility of compensating workers from the employer to the customer. And for recently freed slaves, this meant that even though they were no longer bound by chains, they were still economically disadvantaged. They were forced to rely on the generosity of patrons to earn a living wage, perpetuating a cycle of dependency and economic vulnerability. And since then, tipping has become deeply ingrained in American culture, to the point where it's expected in many service industries. So let's talk about the elephant in the room then, how tipping culture is akin to modern-day wage slavery. Consider this. The federal minimum wage for tipped workers is a pathetic $2.13 per hour, and that rate hasn't budged in over 2 decades. So this means that servers, bartenders, and other tip workers are forced to rely on the generosity of customers to make ends meet. Yeah, $2.13. And it doesn't end there. Research conducted by the Economic Policy Institute found that tip workers are more than twice as likely to live in poverty compared to non-tip workers. Their research has shown that tip workers such as servers, bartenders, and other hospitality industry employees are disproportionately affected by poverty compared to non-tip workers. And there are several factors that contribute to this disparity. The first is low base wages, because tip workers in the United States are often paid a base wage that is significantly lower than the standard minimum wage. And as I stated earlier, the federal minimum wage for tip workers is only $2.13 per hour, which has, again, remained unchanged for many years. And this low base wage means that tipped workers are highly reliant on tips to supplement their income. Another problem with this is income variability, because tip workers often experience unpredictable and fluctuating income due to the variability of the tips. Factors such as the time of day it is, maybe it's a day of the week, the type of establishment. All of those things can impact the amount of tips a worker receives, and this variability makes it difficult for tip workers to budget and plan for their expenses, increasing the risk of falling into poverty. And what I mean by that is, let's say you go to a restaurant. People are probably going to tip better on a Friday than they would on Monday because people tend to go out on a Friday evening. So if you're working the Friday evening shift, you'll probably make more money than someone working the Monday evening shift. Another problem is the lack of benefits. Many tipped workers do not receive benefits such as health insurance, paid sick leave, or retirement contributions from their employers. And this leaves them vulnerable to financial hardship in the event of illness, injury, or other emergencies. And another problem are structural inequities, because tipped workers are disproportionately women and people of color who already face systemic barriers to economic opportunity and advancement. And this further exacerbates their vulnerability to poverty. So what we have here is a system where workers' livelihoods are dependent on the whims of customers, leading to erratic and often insufficient income. And this perpetuates a cycle of economic instability and reinforces the power dynamics between employers and employees. So here's how we address the issue. Well, first, educating ourselves and others about the root causes of tipping culture and its impact on workers' rights and dignity is a crucial step towards fostering positive change in our society. Firstly, understanding the historical and economic context behind tipping culture helps us recognize that it is not merely a benign custom, but rather a system that perpetuates inequality and exploitation. By learning how tipping originated as a way for employers to shift the burden of wages onto customers, particularly in the aftermath of the Civil War, we gain insight into the structural injustices embedded within the practice. Furthermore, educating ourselves about the impact of tipping on workers' rights and dignity allows us to empathize with those who are directly affected by it. We can learn about the struggles faced by tip workers, such as low wages and income instability, the lack of benefits, and vulnerability to harassment and discrimination. And this understanding helps humanize the experiences of workers and fosters empathy and solidarity. Raising awareness about these issues is essential for challenging the status quo and advocating for meaningful change. And by engaging in conversations, sharing information, and amplifying the voices of workers and advocates, we can shine a spotlight on the injustices perpetuated by tipping culture and galvanize public support for reform. Challenging the status quo also involves actively advocating for policy changes and corporate practices that promote fair wages, benefits, and working conditions for all workers. And this may include supporting legislation to eliminate the tip minimum wage, advocating for fair labor practices within industries that rely heavily on tipping, and patronizing businesses that prioritize equitable treatment of their employees. Ultimately, by educating ourselves and others, raising awareness, and taking action to challenge the status quo, we can contribute to building a more equitable and just society where workers are treated with dignity, respect, and fairness. And all of the things I said make perfect sense to me, and may them make sense for you. Well, that wraps up today's episode of The Annoyed Adult. I hope you find our exploration of tipping culture both enlightening and thought-provoking. And as always, I encourage you to continue the conversation and take action to create a positive change in your community. And if you want to listen for more episodes, you can find us on Spotify and on iTunes and wherever podcasts are found. Until next time, see you later.